Hello. In this lecture, I want to talk about well-being, which is what in philosophical literature we refer to as what it is that makes a life good for the person who's living it. We refer to that as well-being. And both of our book authors, both Pinker and Grant, offer some advice about life in general and about what a better frame of mind and healthier thinking habits can do to benefit a life, to make it go better for the person who is living it. But this is a philosophy class, and so I think it would be remiss not to mention a few of the things that philosophy has to contribute to the notion of well-being and to a life well lived. The first thing I'd like to do is point out some recent research that is relevant to the kinds of decisions that people make in pursuing well-being and trying to live the best life. And the first of those recent pieces of research comes from Danny Kahneman, of all people, whose name you've seen in print probably 20 times and who's been mentioned several more. In one of the things that Kahneman has worked on is this notion of the two selves. He spent a large portion of his career studying happiness and fulfillment and all that sort of stuff. And he eventually gave it up because he thought that this problem was just too hard. Well, this is where philosophers will come in to try and pick it up. But basically, Kahneman had this view that there are two selves. He called them the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is the self that lives in the moment and has all of the experiences of a life, right? That's, that lives in the present, right? And almost all of the experiences that you have in a life are forgotten. I mean, think of it, how much of your entire eighth year of life do you remember? How much do you remember of last Tuesday? Again, most of the actual experience that we have are forgotten mostly forever, which is perhaps a little disturbing when you think about it in a certain way. But you do have all of those experiences, even if you don't necessarily later remember them. But that's where the remembering self comes in. The remembering self is the self that tells the story, right, about what happened after the fact. And so it's very, very interesting. One of Kahneman's thought experiments is to say, all right, think about planning a vacation. Because certainly when we do plan vacations, some of the things we plan, some of the things we do on vacation are just to have a pleasant experience, just to have a good time. That is to please the experiencing self. But lots of other things that we do on vacation are to please the remembering self. That is, we have things that we look forward to remembering later, right? Or look forward to having done, or we want to say that we had done this, that, or the other thing, even if sometimes the experience itself isn't very pleasant. So think of Disneyland, for example. It's one of those things where you're building memories, right? Even if the actual experience of Disneyland there's a lot of annoying parts, I'll tell you. But the idea is that after the fact, you can tell the story about, oh, we went to Disneyland, we did this, we saw that, etc. Even if much of it was spent in the hot sun waiting in line. And so there's these differences. And so Kahneman encourages you to think about what kind of a vacation you might plan if you had to take a pill at the end of it that made you forget everything. I think he says we would plan a very different vacation then. Now, he doesn't mean to suggest that the experiencing self is the thing that's important and the remembering self isn't, or vice versa. He says that if you're going to be doing research into happiness, you need to figure this out. Which concept of happiness are you going for? Because they are two different concepts, and we do have them both. And that's the sort of thing that made him largely stop happiness research. But again, that's the thing that philosophers can pick up and say, well, that's pretty interesting, and I think it is pretty interesting. And that's actually all I'm going to say about it. Is that we do have some evidence that that there are at least these two different selves that do regard different parts of our lives as differently valuable and for different reasons. So you might wonder about what we're going to call material factors. If you actually look at the kinds of things that people tend to do in pursuing happiness and trying to live a better life, The things that people spend a lot of time and effort going after are things like health, like wealth, the right kind of relationship, and people very often will think, well, gosh, if I had more money, I'd be happier. If I were healthier, I'd be happier. If I was in the right relationship, I'd be happier, and all that sort of stuff. But research is one of those things that helps to shed light on not whether those things are wise necessarily, but on whether they actually work. And so if you look at the data, for example, of wealth and find out that people aren't necessarily that much happier if they have more wealth, um, well, then then maybe if you were pursuing wealth and the pursuit of happiness may not be that effective either. And so those are all relevant concerns. And so let's take a look at some of these. The first let's take a look at is health. And you'll notice here that it looks like kind of a shotgun, but if you want, you could see something of a trend line kind of going diagonally through here. There's a lot of residuals, of course, but that's the idea. There does tend to be an association between health and happiness, or at least self-reported health, which it seems like people ought to be able to report their own health well. And of course, then there's this positive emotions. That's a self-reported happiness. And again, maybe people are not good gauges of how good their life is going, but maybe people are. But making the assumption that people can self-report their own happiness and their own health reasonably well, it does seem as if there is at least some relationship there. And so making life changes in pursuit of greater health, in general, that seems like it's not a terrible idea. It doesn't seem so ineffective, although there's probably more to it. And so many studies have found this kind of a finding, but wealth is really interesting. Um, and so basically, what these charts essentially indicate is notice that income's on the bottom axis, and sort of lots of other things are on the left and right axis. And you can peruse this graph by pausing the video at any point. But essentially, the conclusion that this is making is that up to a certain point, more money tends to make people more satisfied with their life. And then after a while, it just flattens out, and people with, billions of dollars are not really any happier than people with millions, and people with millions aren't really any happier than people with just, enough. And so some of the conclusions that get drawn, I think one particular way to put it is that it seems like money cannot really buy happiness, but a lack of it can buy misery. And so basically, once you get to the point where a lack of money isn't a major obstacle to a lot of the things that matter, then life satisfaction doesn't get any better with any more money. And that's, I think, a very important finding. It's a very important thing to keep in mind. And it's actually a fairly modest amount. This data here is in 2010 dollars, so it's probably a little bit higher now. But the idea is roughly $75,000 a year is that's where it starts to flatten out. So again, that's not a ridiculous amount of money, really. It's a fair number of people in America have that kind of income. So yeah, it's maybe less than you'd expect, where things just really start plateauing and don't appear to make any real difference to happiness. Affiliation is another thing. So like, the kinds of relationships you have, etc. But this one's, of course, complicated. So if you look at a chart like this one, this is from the Pew Research Center, and it just says it asks, what percentage of people are really happy with their lives, and it sort of breaks that out by, folks who are married and folks who are not married. Now, again, remember what we've said about correlation and causation. There are a lot of confounders likely to be at play here. It may well be that people who are, just sort of miserable people might find it harder to get and stay married. It might not be that being married actually makes one happy. It might instead be that being happy makes one more likely to get or stay married. So it's hard to say what we can learn from the data on that score. So yeah, there we go. And of course, there are many other material factors, but We really haven't found anything that seems to be the silver bullet for giving somebody a life that they themselves are satisfied with, which would make sense to me anyway. It seems like happiness is probably quite a complicated thing. There probably isn't just any one factor that's involved. And of course, if you look into your reading, Grant summarizes what has become quite a large amount of research on the value of intellectual flexibility toward people's satisfaction with their own lives. And not just their own satisfaction with their lives, but their actual life outcomes, sort of, objective measures of how successful people are at various things. Reevaluation seems to be a pretty important factor in life satisfaction and good life outcomes. And so if you want to accomplish your goals better, reevaluating things frequently, as Grant puts it, rethinking, really can be an important and valuable step. One of the other trends in research about happiness and life satisfaction and good life outcomes is is the idea that Grant does mention in pursuing meaning instead of pursuing happiness, right? That in a lot of ways, once things really get evaluated, a lot of times meaning matters more to people. And of course, this is an insight that goes way back in the history of philosophy. And just to pick one person who does say something like this, Mill has as good a quote as any, and it's as follows. Mill says, "Those are only happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of humankind, even on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way." Now you might say, all right, that sounds fine and everything, but how does one pursue meaning? What is that? What is the meaning of meaning? Well, if that's not a question for a philosopher, I don't know what is. And one common answer to the question of what is meaning or where do you look for meaning is that it is in large scale enterprise, right? Another way to put that is something bigger than yourself. Very often, the most common sources of meaning in people's lives tend to be derived from some contribution to something or belonging to something that's larger than oneself. So some of the examples include things like things like family, right? That a lot of people see in their family legacy a lot of deep meaning and importance. Sometimes being part of a larger organization like a nation, even a group of nations. Religion is one common feature of something, some project that is much larger than any individual. So many people do, in fact, find meaning in those kinds of overarching spiritual pursuits. And of course, in building things, that's one of the things that makes the pyramids so incredible is that they were ostensibly built just to be something that everybody could be impressed with and everybody could be proud of. They say, look, I was a part, right? And in fact, one of the stories that if you went to school, decades ago, they would have taught you that the pyramids were largely built with slave labor. Um, there was slave labor involved, but it seems like some recent research is indicating there was an awful lot of volunteer labor. And you might say, volunteer labor? Who would volunteer for something like this? And you might say, the pyramids are still there and people still marvel and talk about them. Who wouldn't want to be a part of that? Who wouldn't want to contribute, even in some small way, to something that's that much bigger than oneself? Something that thousands of years later people will still be looking at and admiring. That's not nothing. And so, being part of large-scale projects of various kinds is another place that people can really derive meaning, if that's what you're looking for, meaning rather than just the feeling of being happy. And so when we start to think about what's important, what kinds of contributions might be sort of worthwhile to devote some of our life's attention to, conduct something like this sort of a thought experiment. Right? So what I want you to do is I want you to name somebody who's been dead for 500 years or more, right? I mean, the 500 years is sort of an arbitrary cutoff point, but let's say, yeah, 500 years. And if you're not quite sure, but you know they've been dead an awful long time, go ahead and say them anyway, right? But think of, a couple, three people that have been, dead for 500 years. The names you still know, right? Despite the fact that they've been dead an awful long time. Okay. All right. So you've got a short list in mind. What kinds of folks are you naming? What did they do? Why do you know who they still are? Like, why do you still know who they are, given that they've been dead for that long? And I think chances are you named thinkers, right? People with great ideas, artists. Okay, you probably named possibly religious figures, like spiritual leaders, or other kinds of leaders, like nationally, leaders of nations and movements and things like that. And it seems like those are the kinds of if somebody remembers you 500 years later, you probably did something important, right? I mean, sometimes people get remembered for the wrong reasons. People will probably remember Hitler for a long time, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But I bet you most of the people that you named actually are people you might remember for good reasons. And that's, I think, much more common that we remember people for the good things they've done than remembering history's great villains. There certainly have been some. But 500 years is an awful long time for the villains to fade away and for the great heroes to still live on. And so maybe, think twice when you tell somebody that maybe art is a waste of time. Again, maybe it's not the most suitable thing for a career for everybody, but it's certainly no waste of time. It's one of those things that we think is valuable enough that those who have done great artistic achievements are largely still remembered, even long after they're dead. So I think this is a nice way of maybe refocusing, thinking, all right, what if we really do want to commit ourselves to something of lasting importance? It makes sense to reflect on what we think is of lasting importance. And that brings in the last section here. In addition to recent research, I think ancient wisdom still has a place here. When an idea occurs in philosophy, generally everybody else examines that idea to try and figure out what there is wrong with it. And so the kinds of ideas that tend to survive for a really, really long time tend to be pretty good, right? They tend to survive this really harrowing process. And so by now, philosophers have really made quite a lot more progress than you would think, given that they don't usually like to put questions down, certainly not forever. But the question of how to live, what is the best life, what is well-being, is certainly an old one that I think some of these ancient perspectives that we're still talking about, by the way, can really shed some interesting insight on. And so when you ask what is the best life for a human being, there are generally a few different views that are recognized in philosophy as pretty decent families of answers to that question. So this is a very broad outline. Of course, there's lots of specifics with some of these views. There are lots of different versions and subversions of a lot of these views, and things can get technical and complicated really fast. But I'm just going to give you the broad outlines of some of these general approaches. And so those approaches tend to fall into one of four camps. One of those is to say that the life of pleasure is the best life, right? So that is the best life is the one with the most pleasure and the least pain in it, the end, right? It sounds very simple, and that's a virtue of that particular approach. It's also fairly plausible. It might actually be true, but it might not be. Other theories have it that what makes a life good is that desires are satisfied, not because it feels good to satisfy those desires. That's the first view, but because whatever it feels like, the actual satisfaction of a desire, of a goal is of some kind, is that's what just makes the life good. Other views say that it's the elimination of desire that actually makes for the best life. And then finally, there are a family of views called objectivist views that have the view that it's not just any one thing. There's actually a whole bunch of things that are good, that contribute to a good life, and you should try and get as many of them as you can, given that some of them trade off with other ones. So first, let's talk about this, the life of pleasure. The view that pleasure is what makes a good life is also known as hedonism. It's also sometimes known as Epicureanism after one of its most famous advocates, the ancient philosopher Epicurus, who's sort of more or less pictured at left. Uh, that was a well-known view in the ancient world. Of course, then as now, it's been a little bit maligned by its critics. It's the view that pleasure is the only intrinsically good thing and pain is the only intrinsically evil thing, right? Pleasure is the only thing that's good in and of itself. Pain is the only thing that's bad in and of itself. And so the way that hedonists argue for their view is oftentimes to say something like, okay, well, why did you, for example, come to class today or are watching this lecture today? And you might say, oh, well, like I, wanted to get better grades. And you say, why do you want to get good grades? And it's like, well, because I want a good job when I get out of here. It's like, well, what do you want a good job for? So I can make more money. What do you want more money for? Well, so I can have the things I enjoy. And they say, what do you want to enjoy things for? And now all of a sudden the questions stop making sense. You say, wait, did you ask why I want to enjoy things? What's so good about enjoyment? Have you tried that? And so it seems like our questions bottom out when we say, "Hey, why would you want pleasure?" You're like, have you tried it?" Right? I mean, it's like, why would you want to avoid pain? It's like, well, again, have you tried it? And so it seems like there's all of a sudden the why question stops making sense once we hit sort of pleasures and pains and things like that. It's a reasonable argument for the view, but of course, it might be that there are plenty of other things that stop really making sense, in terms of that question. And before you sort of get carried away, the hedonists were not, despite what it sounds like, they were not craven party animals. Epicurus himself counseled a life of tranquility and very simple pleasures. And the reason he did that, he says, don't eat too much, right? And don't eat fancy food all the time, even though, like, eating a lot and eating fancy food is pleasurable. He says, in the long run, there's a lot of pain that comes along with that, right? So he says, if you go through a patch which you're a little bit unlucky, which happens, and all of a sudden you can't eat your fine, rich food anymore, well, you're going to be miserable. But if you never really needed the fine, rich food in the first place, you were content with simpler stuff, well, then when you do get some fancy rich food, you'll enjoy it more, right? But if you don't need it or don't get in the habit of it, well, then you don't get any pain if it gets taken away. So in a lot of ways, the ancient hedonists anyway were sort of more pain avoiders than pleasure seekers. And so they counsel, again, a simple life of simple pleasures, because those are the ones that tend to avoid pains that sometimes come along with overindulgence. And again, I think this view is really fine for the experiencing self. And in fact, I think it's probably one of the better views in terms of the experiencing self. I think maybe not so much for the remembering self. I think at the end of one's life, if all you have to say for it is, oh, well, I had a good time, I don't know. I think that there are probably better lives available. So, I mean, maybe, for example, one wants to accomplish some important goals. And that brings us to our next view. And that's the desire satisfaction view. And you'll notice that the photographs here are not of ancient people, they're of fairly modern people. Part of the reason for that is that the desire satisfaction view has gotten its fullest development very recently in philosophy, that is, in living memory by people who are actually still alive, like David Sobel. And though I will say Dale Dorsey is not one of the most famous advocates of a desire satisfaction theory of well-being, but he was my dissertation advisor. This is my lecture. I went ahead and put him in there. So there you go. In any case, the desire satisfaction view, it is a whole family of views that hold that the quality of a life, how good a life is determined by how many desires were fulfilled, right? And most sub-varieties of the desire satisfaction view are generated addressing what are called oddball desire objections. So for example, imagine that for whatever reason, I just really, really want there to be an odd number of stars in the universe, right? Now, whether there is or isn't, we'll never know, okay? But if that desire that I have for there to be an odd number of stars in the universe somehow gets fulfilled, has my life gone really any better? Right? Imagine that I have this fantasy of, imagine I just really want there to be a Chinese pope. And imagine that a couple or three popes after I die, there's a Chinese pope, right? Does that mean that my life now all of a sudden went better, even though it's been over for a while? It's hard to say, right? And so, uh, 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 you know, those are some desires that don't appear to have any impact on well-being one way or other, whether they're satisfied or not. But there are also some weirder ones, like imagine that somebody just really wanted to chew light bulbs or to spend all of their time making sure that every blade of grass in their yard was exactly the same height, like they just devoted their life to that. Um, I mean, okay, so maybe those desires were fulfilled, but again, does that seem to make the life go any better? I don't know. It's very strange. And desire satisfaction theorists have some answers to these things. These are not knockdown arguments necessarily, but there are some reasons why some have found the view to be less than persuasive. And this is most plausibly what the remembering self is going for, this idea of desire satisfaction, of being able to tell a story where a kind of goal was accomplished, a kind of desire was satisfied, right? That's there's a narrative arc there, and that's very important to the remembering self as a narrative arc. The story of a life is in some ways more important than each individual moment of the life. But perhaps we desire things because they're good rather than things are good because we desire them. And that tends to be one of the bigger issues, right, with the desire satisfaction view. A kind of opposite to the desire satisfaction view is in fact the desire elimination view. And this is reasonably widespread throughout the history of philosophy, both East and West. Um, Keep in mind, I'm no great expert on Buddhism and Eastern philosophy, but in broad outline, the Buddhist view of the world is that desire is the root of suffering, and that a program of meditation and good behavior can liberate a person from their desires and achieve what's known as enlightenment. That is being, sort of leaving the desires behind, stopping all the striving, recognizing various moments in life as just being the way they are, not necessarily being good or being bad, or not necessarily wanting them to be different, just being comfortable like with the way things are. And it seems to be a very restful and peaceful view that I think has a lot of appeal. And there are echoes of it in Western philosophy as well. For example, the school of thought known as Stoicism says that well-being consists in virtue, and they counsel a program of meditation and good behavior that can liberate you from all of your external distresses. They want to say, oh, like, stop being so concerned about how the world is, stop being concerned about whether you're getting what you want or not. Instead, just, start, like, be in some sense just content with however things are, and then the world just loses all of its power to cause any misery in you. And again, it's a very grounded, very level, very restful way of life. And Stoicism has seen something of a resurgence in modern times. You see, there's actually a number of therapies now that are counseling something like Stoicism, and some self-help books that are like, yeah, be like the Stoics. And, so there's been a little bit of a resurgence. And I think I can see why in this modern world of hustle and bustle. And so I think that there is a kind of appeal to a life lived this way. And it does go very much against some of the tenets of modern society. But such views have seen a resurgence, and perhaps they do have something important to teach us about meaning and about virtue. The last set of views I wanted to take a look at here is these objective list views, right? And so most objective list views include pleasure. But in addition to pleasure, some of the common entries that people will point to and say, look, these are also things that a good life needs. Because most objectivist theorists say, oh, look, pleasure is part of a good life. It's hard to imagine any kind of life being a good one if it were also attended with just tremendous pain the whole time, right? So you might say, no matter how good of an achievement you make, no matter what kind of a desire you satisfy, no matter what else happens, if your life is just full of tremendous pain, it seems like it would be bad. And I think that's fair. But objectivist theorists think that there's more to life than just pleasure, even though pleasure is an important component of a good life. Other things they'll point to include things like friendship, knowledge, achievement, right? Virtue, autonomy, etc., etc. And so there are as many different objectivist views as there are good things you can imagine. And so then the question is, all right, how do you figure out what should go on the list? How do you figure out what should stay off the list? And of course, I'll have to admit this is the view that I like best. But it does face some problems of genuine trade-offs. It seems like pursuing some of these good things has to come at the expense of other good things, and it's really difficult to tell how to pursue one good thing at the expense of another. These things really do trade off against one another. Um, some people see that as a major problem with the view. I tend to think of it as evidence that the view sort of makes good sense. I think it's more important that a view be true and less important that it be simple. In any case, no matter which of these views is ultimately the right one or the best one, I think that the act of asking the question is really important. The act of actively thinking about it is really important. After all, you have to have some reason why you're pursuing one particular kind of action or another, or trying to live your life in one particular way as opposed to another. And having some concrete idea of why you want to pursue one kind of life or another kind of life makes a lot of sense. Anything that you do on purpose, with intent, with a plan, with some thought that goes along with it, is bound to be more successful and more satisfying than something that just happens automatically, where you just sort of, fly by the seat of your pants the whole time. And so I'd like to end this particular lecture, and I guess the course, with the way that Pinker ends the book Rationality. I think it's it's right on. It's a good ending. And so he says it this way. He says, "The power of rationality is to guide moral progress, is of a piece with its power to guide material progress and wise choices in our lives. Our ability to eke increments of well-being out of a pitiless cosmos and to be good to others despite our flawed nature depends on grasping impartial principles that transcend our parochial experience. We are a species that has been endowed with an elementary faculty of reason and that has discovered formulas and institutions that magnify its scope. They awaken us to ideas and expose us to realities that confound our intuitions, but are true for all that."